Hello and welcome everyone to the final ADS and AMDS webinar in the COVID-19 series. So we have a very exciting webinar lined up for you today, and our moderator Marc Salomon will tell you more about it in a moment. Firstly, I would like to thank our sponsors and our partners Elsevier, Google and Amsterdam Medical Data Science for helping us to organize these events. I'm very happy. Thank you, Jane. I'm very happy to introduce the speakers. As Jane said, this is the last of a series of seminars that we did around COVID-19 with all kinds of different topics. We organized it together with our sponsors and with Amsterdam Medical Data Science. And as you know, Amsterdam Data Science and Amsterdam Medical Data Science are cooperations between the universities in Amsterdam and the Center for Mathematics and Computer Science, and also the University of Applied Sciences across all areas. So not only in economics or computer science, but also psychology, humanities, all the areas we would like to cover. And one of our main activities is organizing these kind of meetups and also networking. So we want to be a place where people from different areas in academia, but also from the industry, from companies and the government meet each other. Now, today we have a very interesting program, I think. The first speaker, it is all around media and fake news and how to influence the audience. And we have found two experts that will give talks on this topic. The first one will be Marcel Becker. And Marcel is an associate professor at the Radboud University. He is a philosopher and he is working in applied ethics. And Marcel, we are very happy that you are here today and want to give your talk. And the Zoom floor is now yours.
The truth in science, politics and media triangle, or Trinity. As said, I'm a philosopher, and in philosophy I'm working on applied ethics. I do several things in applied ethics. A few years ago I wrote a book about the ethics of digitalization. I'm currently finishing a book about the ethics of law and judiciary officials, and I'm very interested in the ethics of public policy, and those things also will come together in my in this talk. The next slide. Okay, because there is an information topic, not to say an information problem in COVID-19 times. We have an infodemic, and some people even speak about a disinfodemic. The first thing a philosopher does in such a situation is that he tries to make distinctions. For instance, the distinction between misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Misinformation is false information. Disinformation is information that is false with the clear intention to mislead. And conspiracy theories can be described as a kind of explanations in terms of a secret plot by a covert alliance of powerful individuals. I will not talk about this kind of distinctions. I will talk about something else. The core question of my talk is how to deal, when you are a scientist, how to deal with this kind of phenomena in a proper way. The first reflection of a scientist, the first reaction, the first reflex, not reflection, but the first reflex of the scientist in situations when confronted with misinformation or disinformation or conspiracy theories is to talk about the truth. As a famous scientist has said, it is time to put information, right information, in the driver's seat of global and national epidemic response. And then he means the information about what is true. Indeed, I will not say anything negative about the concept truth. I will only put it in a certain perspective. Indeed, in policy making, COVID-19, truth is very important, because information directly influences people's behavior. When we talk about the quality of information, we also talk about the way people are influenced in their behavior, and people's behavior has enormous consequences how to deal with the COVID-19 problem. So information is very important, absolutely. But is the right way to talk the importance of information, is right to talk about that in terms of the truth? I have my doubts. Because talking about truth, we are inclined to talk about truth as a kind of entity that is somewhere and that can be laid bare. We talk about truth finding. We talk about discovering the truth. And those expressions suggest truth is something over there and we can find it. At the same time, a funny paradox in fact, we all recognize that the truth doesn't exist. So what are we doing as scientists? We're trying to attain, to find something, to lay bare something, to discover something that should be over there. At the same time, we admit that it does not exist. That is a tension. And I try to find a way out of this tension by proposing that we talk about truth as a verb, and indeed the verb truth finding. And when we use the word truth finding, we talk about the process, not about a thing to be found, but a process, the way we do it. And when we describe as a process, we come to indeed the clear idea that there are different ways of truth finding. Just an easy example, the notion truth finding plays a role in court. It's up to the criminal law to work on truth finding, and also the scientist does on truth finding, is working on truth finding. At the same time, they have different ways of doing so. Because in criminal law, the judge aims at judging. Within a given time frame, a final verdict must be reached. A verdict with huge consequences for persons. You can even send someone in prison. So there is a limited time framework within a certain decision must be reached. The scientist, I would always say on the opposite of that, cultivates an attitude of doubt, cultivates an attitude of suspicion, cultivates an attitude of a never-ending discussion. So for the judge, the discussion must have an end, whereas for the scientist, the process of truth finding is a never-ending story. So two different ways of truth finding. And the contrast becomes even bigger when we contrast scientific truth finding versus politics. The contrast becomes even bigger. Well, let's nuance that a bit. What is the relation between scientific truth finding and political and public discussions? It's often framed in terms of objectivity, science versus arbitrariness, and subjective opinions on the side of the public. I think that can be nuanced. When we talk about process, we talk about science as rigorous methods, and open discussion is of course part of this method. The process in politics is not a matter of only power play or arbitrariness or subjective opinions. The process in politics is that there are competing claims in society about what is just, what is meaningful, and that we have to deal with the problem of different competing claims in society about these topics. And that distinction between science and politics, when we frame it in this way, we see that it is more than objective facts versus subjective norms and values. Because science uses its facts, okay, but the notion facts is derived from the Latin word facere, and that means making, producing. So science has also a subjective side, so to say. And in society, there can exist a wide consensus about core norms and core values. So the distinction between science and what goes on in society is not only objectivity versus arbitrariness, subjectivity. Neither is a distinction one of that the scientist should possess knowledge versus laity, because every person in society can derive all kinds of information from the internet. Now, the difference between what goes on in science and what goes on in society, I think the difference can best be framed as between, on one hand, application of methods. The science has its own methodologies that enables him to reach some knowledge on one hand, and the science is an expert. He has specialistic education in his methods on one hand, versus on the other hand, questions of meaning. And in questions of meaning in our democracy, happily, everyone has a say. That is the relation between science and society. That's the distinction between these two. For instance, when we take the 1.5 meter, there is specialistic expertise that shows quite convincingly that 1.5 meter reduces the spread of the virus. Okay, but next to that, we have all kinds of questions of meaning. What is the price we are willing to pay for reduction of the spread of the virus? What is the price for that in terms of money? What is the price of that in terms of health? The latter set of questions is a set of questions of the meaning that we attach to things, to money, and to our health. And there can be a societal discussion about that. I gave my talk the title, Triangle or Trinity. I haven't spoken about media yet, but it will be clear that I more choose for the notion of triangle than for Trinity, because I talk about different ways of thinking, different methods, and of course what happens in science and what happens in public policy is related to each other, but they are both domains with their own ways of thinking, domains with their own logic. In the Trinity, that is the image in which things are merged, in which things come together. But the emphasis in my talk lies on the difference between the different domains. And the difference becomes even stronger when we look at 20th and 21st century philosophy, sociology, where there has been a huge emphasis on the heterogeneity in domains in society. And in many domains in society, there are different ways of speaking, ways of thinking. And this is what you see here in red is in fact a short overview of 20th century philosophy and 20th century sociology. I think you never in your life saw such a short overview of these two, of what has gone on in these two disciplines past 120 years. Different circuits, different domains in society, each with their own ways of thinking. That does not imply, when I tell this story, that I'm a relativist, because each domain is characterized by vital norms that are necessary to keep this domain as it is and to guarantee the quality of the interactions and the communication within these domains. But when we talk about present-day society, we have to take account the differences between these domains. However, and to take account the difference between these domains is important to understand what is the surplus value and what is the quality of the things that are going on in each domain. However, now we come to digitalization. What is characteristic of digitalization? In any case, digital media are characterized by the fact that they contribute to what I here have described as the blurring of boundaries. Common, usual separations between domains, between different spheres in society become less visible because of digitalization. That has advantages, absolutely, it has advantages, but in terms of information, there comes a serious problem. Because all information comes, you could always say, almost say, in the same way to people, And it means that that it is harder for people to distinguish between information that is coming from an established institution or information that is clearly fake news. It both comes to people in digital ways. Whereas earlier, the information from the established scientific institution came in the form of a book, and the fake news came in the form of a gossip. But now both gossip and both the content of the book come to people by social media, by digital media, often social media. And that means that the classic statement of Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, in fact is wrong in this case. Not the medium is the message, not the digital medium is the message, but instead we should distinguish between, on the one hand, the medium, the digital medium, but on the other hand, the original source that has given the information. And there are huge differences in original sources related to the different domains in society. Of course, social media have advantages. They do empirical research by scientists working in Amsterdam, by the way. Empirical research has shown that social media do contribute to larger participation in debates. Nevertheless, the disadvantage, the problem that I have just mentioned, is a real problem. When we talk about sphere, domain of society, what can we say about the sphere, the domain of social media? What is their logic? What is their rationality? Well, quite clear, their logic, their rationality is in clear contrast with what goes on in science. Social media are platforms for emotional gratification. Apologize for the generalization, but I have only 15 minutes talk, so I have to make a few blunt statements. Well, but there is a wide agreement in literature that social media for a large part are platforms for emotional gratification. The focus is on liking, even spoken about attention bulimia and attention economy. Beautiful work is done by social scientists that have described how people how people act and interact on social media. And important in any case, it is a platform for emotional gratification primarily, and therefore information is not always created to inform others, but it is more to express your worry and to express your concern. Facebook has many descriptions. Past decades, Facebook regularly changed its own description of what it was doing, but the notion connection was always there. That is a kind of stop-lap of Mark Zuckerberg, connection. He wants to connect people, he says already decades. In fact, he says connection, he suggests at least, connection might be more important than truth. The focus on connection and not always on truth. And indeed, then emotions can play their role, can go their way. Something that spreads faster than infection is fear, he says. And fear makes people vulnerable, and misinformation and medical distrust are just around the corner. So this kind of mechanism, psychological mechanisms do go on social media. Parallel with that, but I won't elaborate on that further, is the emergence of identity politics. It means that knowledge is in identity politics, be it right-wing identity politics, Trump, or be it left-wing identity politics, Black Lives Matter. In identity political frames, knowledge is incorporated into the framework of identity, and that can just aggravate the disagreement between people because their own identity is at stake. So objective, neutral discussions about facts is even harder to reach. And you understand, and it is widely agreed, that the emergence of identity politics and the emergence of social media, that they are parallel developments. What can we do on it? What are the challenges that we face as scientists? Well, first, I think it is important to make a distinction between psychology on one hand and normativity on one hand. What people are doing on social media, we understand it. It's just human. They're just human. We can understand all kinds of psychological mechanisms that go on social media. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we can always justify the statements they make in normativity. So there is a difference to look at the psychological process that is going on and the statement that people make. And you can understand what they say psychologically, but it's not necessary that you agree with them in a normative way. It is up to scientists to make clear why their knowledge can be trusted, to tell something about their method, about the methodologies, to tell about the work that they have done, to tell about the doubts that they have, and that doubts improves on the longer term knowledge. And then the next step, of course, also involve citizens in science. Interesting, I talk sometimes with journalists about identity politics and social media, and what journalists are doing more and more is using the narrative frame to tell the message in terms of a story. The narrative frame is already hundreds of years used in journalism, but it is still more used. In times of identity politics and social media, people like telling and hearing stories. That is what a journalist does in order to reach his or her audience. That's also what a scientist might do, to tell a story. And last, as scientists, we have our doubts. And sometimes the fact that we have our doubts, the fact that we have discussions, the fact that we are correcting ourselves as a scientific community, we experience it as a merit of our working, and many people consider it to be a shortcoming of science, because science doesn't make that clear, blunt, eternal truth statements. We must try to present our doubt more as a virtue and not as a shortcoming. These are the tasks, the challenges that scientists face to go next years in times of COVID, but probably also the years after. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marcel, for a very interesting talk. I think some questions have come in the Q&A. Probably we first go through these questions. Probably Jane or Julia, you could read out some of these questions, and then Marcel, you could probably reflect on them.
Yeah, so I saw one, a little bit longer question coming in, which is worth asking you. Yeah. Thank you for this session. A question remark I would love to hear your take on is this. In my honest opinion, science and scientific research cannot be an objective matter, since scientists always work on discoveries mainly based on a hypothesis formed by one's mind belief. With almost always a limited set of information/data, will it be an approach to renew the way we do research by making sure data sets used are as broad complete as possible and automating the process of hypothesis validation instead of relying on one's mindset?
Indeed, hypothesis. So when people look closer at science, and when I talk with people who are not scientists about what science are doing, then I say, well, but we talk about methods, but there is one method that is valid for all science. Different sciences have their own methods. Next to that, scientists work with hypotheses, and each scientist has its own hypothesis. And next to that, there are also things like questions, the core questions at the start of a research connected with the hypothesis. So there are so many reasons why science is not, in a certain sense, objective, why science does not have an overall view on things, but why science has a perspective on things. Indeed, and we should do, I think as scientists, we have a task in communicating just that to the people. And as long as we use the notion truth, we suggest that we find something that is over there. But when we communicate better, that we also have our perspectives. also our hypothesis with good reasons, also our research questions, our own methods in different sciences. When we communicate that better to people, then people will better understand that we don't find it true, but that we also have our own perspective. Nevertheless, we should not be relativistic about that. So there is a clear distinction between saying, I have my own method because I stand in my own scientific tradition. And on the other hand, science is just a meaning. Science is just an opinion. The latter is relativistic. The former is just doing science.
And then does that also answer the question, as in, what is the role of experts or self-appointed experts, and how should you react?
The role of experts is on one hand to be not too shy and to be not too modest and to make their claims, and on the other hand, not to make their claims in terms of eternal truth, but to make their claims in terms of that they have done their research and that with good reasons can make this claim.
Yeah, I think that is the two main questions for this Q&A.
I had a question which is probably difficult to ask to a philosopher, but it's about opinion. Probably you don't like questions on opinions, but I'm interested in your opinion on how politics, science and media dealt in the Netherlands with the COVID-19 situation. And what could we learn from that? And what would you suggest we should do differently next time, or next phase?
Well, I think overall, there are many countries in the world where situations have developed worse, also in terms of how politics deal with the problem, how the media deal with the problem, and how the public dealt with the problem. We are asked by the government to take our responsibility in a smart lockdown process. We took our responsibility. The media communicated quite properly about it. Nevertheless, sometimes I think discussions might have been some sharper. Distinction between what does media do, what is responsibility of scientists, and what is responsibility of politics might have been some more clearly distinguished. For instance, people talk about the prescriptions of the RIVM. The RIVM doesn't give any prescriptions. The RIVM just gives scientific knowledge, and then the government gives prescriptions. For instance, people talked about influencers who on a certain moment said, we are not bothered by the 1.5 meter, we go our own way. At that moment, we could have had a sharper discussion about what is the role and responsibility of influencers, and what are they in fact doing when they say we do not take seriously the scientific methods. And so there were some moments at which the discussion could have been sharper, and sharper discussion makes that things become more clear. But so overall, we can be happy with past half year, relatively happy with how we dealt with the problem. But as I said, sometimes we could.
Yeah. And sharper, you're in fact saying the role should be made more clear of the different stakeholders.
Yeah. Yeah, different. Yeah, you call it stakeholders.
I'm from economics.
You're from economics, but I'm from philosophy. I would say the different spheres, the different practices that are guided by different norms and that have their own responsibility. We live in a time with many overflows and many blurring boundaries, but we should not forget that the quality of your work is dependent often on the standards that you used, given your own background. So in a time of blurring boundaries, we should not come to an erosion of the quality of work. And that is one of the core ideas of my message. And okay, then you can use the word stakeholders, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and we are now very much interested in what Emily, the Keulenaar, is going to present to us. Emily is a PhD researcher in the Humanities faculty at the University of Amsterdam, and she is also a member of the Open Intelligence Lab and the Digital Democracy Group. Emily, the Zoom floor is yours. And thank you, Marcel.
So the presentation I'm about to give, I have to admit, is going to benefit a lot from Marcel's presentation, in that it's a mostly empirical research that explores all the various problematics that Marcel just spoke about, and the various ways of speaking truth and the impact that that has primarily on public consensus and the production of misinformation online. So one of the things that I'd like to start pointing out is, because I do research primarily on the online realm, so what platforms do with concerns to misinformation and how exactly users on those platforms consume misinformation and how or why. One of the interesting things to note regarding the COVID pandemic is that platforms have taken, as well as media outlets to a certain extent, have taken a quite proactive stance at trying to curtail and somewhat contain, if not in sort of local terminology, deplatform or delete false information. They have published various policies stating what kinds of information they don't like or they wouldn't want to accept on their platforms. This example here being YouTube, and what kinds of measures they can take to delete it and why. And this kind of perspective, though it is useful, borrows, as Marcel mentioned before, on a particular definition of misinformation as objectively false information. So one that doesn't have any degree of expertise or any degree of trustworthiness that the public should consume or trust. But what's interesting and very problematic about COVID-19 is that because it's a topic of still scientific research, it generates not just a lot of research still, but also a lot of confusion and contradicting guidelines by governments. One example being, for instance, this discussion here in the Netherlands about whether or not kids are contagious or not, or whether one should wear a mask or not, or whether the virus is airborne or not, and all those things. And so the classification of COVID misinformation or false information in the pandemic as misinformation is dismisses somehow this other category of information, which reflects more to misunderstandings and lack of, or still formation of consensus around things that are not known yet. And so our research, which I'm not unfortunately going to have enough time to detail, to do full justice to, but tries to capture this particular phenomenon by doing data analysis, so capturing misunderstandings and factual ambiguities and formation of consensus around these things. And just shortly, one way that we did that in this particular expose that I'm about to show is basically to focus on three areas or three axes of the pandemic. So transmission, treatment, and prevention, and comparing what authoritative sources, that is, the actors that are responsible for giving information on the pandemic, governments, public health organizations, mainly English-speaking ones, versus their respective audiences, or I would like to say citizens, but for the purpose of methodology, I have to restrict it to users who reply or engage with authoritative sources online, on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, namely. How exactly these two actors contradict each other, whether or not they pay attention to the same facts, whether they publish the same facts, and whether they mutually ignore some of the things they talk about when they talk about transmission, treatment, and prevention. And so in this case, what we did was to collect from various sources terms that translate to both true, false, or both facts from authoritative sources and audiences. And then we kind of narrowed it down to specific dictionaries. And then from those dictionaries, we filtered 3 or 4 data sets here, one coming from YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and the web, that each reflect different statements made by authoritative sources and their audiences. So for instance, on YouTube, we got all the videos that the White House, the CDC, the World Health Organization and other actors have published. And then we obtained their transcripts, and then we saw what kinds of statements and facts they published about transmission, treatment, and prevention, and what the users who commented on those videos said. And then we cleaned up the our data sets a little bit, and we also coded different claims. I'll make myself clear in a few slides by showing you a couple of examples. These are some of the authoritative sources that we used. So that's, like I said, all English-speaking, the presidents and the public health organizations of the 5 most infected English-speaking countries by end of March. So that was Canada, Ireland, the US, the UK, and Australia. So one way to illustrate what I mean in this particular case is with this little heat map here that basically shows you all the specific terms or quote unquote facts about COVID transmission in this particular case, that on the left here, authoritative sources have claimed on social media, so Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, versus their audiences, so people who reply or engage with them. And one of the first things that we see here is that, of course, they talk about relatively different things at relatively different times. So for instance, one first distinction is that the audiences speak a lot about 5G or the virus being airborne, or they point out the things that the authoritative sources don't necessarily point out. So there is divergence of attention there, of facts. So for instance, the gray rows here point out to certain attention for food, mosquito, petrol, radiation, breast milk, and chicken, which authoritative sources just dismiss or don't debunk at all, or don't refer to at all. And in other cases, as I said earlier, with 5G, airborne, and animal contagion, these are things that official sources, authoritative sources pick up on and debunk. And that is illustrated by the instance where little square is in purple. But what's most interesting, I think, with this figure is a situation where there is significant attention in audiences for certain facts, like droplet contagion, or droplet nuclei contagion, or the virus being airborne or not, and authoritative sources not necessarily engaging as much, and thus pointing out to a very active and continuous debate on the part of audiences. So it's a sort of unsettled fact in a sense. It's something that they haven't quite put a truth to or flagged a truth to. And what I mean by that, for instance, is this whole discussion about whether the virus is airborne or not. As you can see in this particular figure, the little traits here indicate statements made by authoritative sources on their websites, while the dense mass that fluctuates over time is what the audiences say about 3 different statements, namely in blue that that COVID is not airborne, in pink that it is airborne, and in gray that it's somewhat uncertain. And one of the things we see there is that, well, in the beginning, most authoritative sources will claim that, or the World Health Organization, namely, will claim that it's uncertain whether it's airborne or not. Different authoritative sources actually start to contradict each other. So the White House begins to say that it is, while the World Health Organization in the Pacific branch says that it's not, and then generates a whole lot of engagement by its users on Twitter who retweet it en masse. And at the same time, other Twitter users also retweet en masse the statement by the White House. And it's only much later that the international branch of the World Health Organization will clarify that it is airborne, but only within 1 meter. But that's only after a series of other authoritative sources kind of back up the White House. So you see there's also internal contradiction between authoritative sources, and the curious thing is that there are also contradictions about audiences, but at the same time. As contradicting statements by authoritative sources are made at the same time, so the audiences kind of also contradict each other. And then if we still zoom in into what this debate is all about, whether it is airborne or not, depending on whether it's contaminated by droplets or aerosols, which are even tiny little droplets that are maybe stay up in the air for longer because they're lighter. There too, the authoritative sources contradict each other, mainly between the White House and the World Health Organization, and audiences retweet either one or the other depending on the kind of authority that they would like to follow, whether they rely mostly on the White House or the World Health Organization. And coincidentally or uncoincidentally, a lot of, according at least to a report that was released by the Oxford Internet Institute by Brennan and a couple of other co-authors, most misinformation, COVID misinformation as of, I believe, end of April, was indeed about transmission. So community spread and equally the sorts of public advice and authority that governments would advise. Now, I'm going to try to make this as fast as possible, but one of the second kind of research questions that we sort of deepened this research was, how exactly can we reinforce public consensus then to make sure that everyone is on track on the same guidances and relatively the same perspective of what reality COVID constitutes medically and in terms of security. And it's interesting to note that, I mean, you probably have noticed, well, browsing the web, Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, that as soon as you query something like COVID, each of those platforms provide you with a series of sort of really facts. There is no better way than to describe it, particularly local facts and guidances on the virus. So they kind of, the act there is to centralize as much local governmental information on the virus as soon as you browse it. But I think one of the caveats there is also, as Marcel pointed out very interestingly, is what do you do with users that have already quite radicalized perspectives of the crisis, namely people who maintain conspiracy theories. So if they query something like QAnon, COVID, what kind of information are they getting? Are they still getting this kind of information? Are they getting something completely different? And then what does that mean for public consensus? So again, I'm almost about to run out of time, but what we did to verify this is we designed a couple of search queries that reflect on COVID conspiracies, like COVID is a hoax, or QAnon, which is this famous kind of conspiracy that Trump is saving the world from pedophiles, amongst other things. Not to, it's a little bit more complex than that, but that's one of the things. The idea that it's kind of a coveted act and things like that. And then with those queries, we collected results from YouTube, namely the sort of videos that you obtain when you query those things on the search results. And we wanted to see what is their ranking over time, what kinds of videos you get over time in the search results, and where authoritative sources are in this ranking, and how many of the false or conspiratorial videos are still available over time. Just as a context, we also read the content moderations by YouTube, and we found that most of the techniques that YouTube uses is either removal of false content, namely any content that contradicts the World Health Organization, they state, on treatment, diagnostic, transmission, and prevention. Or also, if you go a little bit way back on YouTube's misinformation policy, one of the solutions they also employ is to, as they say, demote what they call borderline content. Borderline content is content that's it's a little bit more difficult as to say whether it's completely true or false or hateful or not hateful. It's a little bit in between. One of the examples that they give are conspiracy theories, for instance, or statements that the Sandy Hook shooting never took place, or things like that. And one of the ways to do demoting then is to sort of bury down that kind of borderline content in the search results or recommendation results. And then to have more trustworthy or authoritative sources be up. So have like news media and journalistic outlets and medical organizations be up your search results. So we're going to test that out. And one of the things that we found was that actually the ratio of uploaded videos, or so the search results for these queries that we designed, kind of gives us somewhat constant ratio of deleted videos that are false or borderline. And so there is no dramatic change there based on the different content moderation policies that YouTube presents. What we do find, however, is that any if we kind of filter on the videos by their transcripts and their descriptions with the keywords that they use, we find that most of the deleted videos actually are exactly these kinds of videos that YouTube points out. So it's videos that talk about vaccination being false, or COVID being a sort of public hysteria or sabotage, or being part of some sort of Chinese bioweapon and things like that. So it's, in other words, very decipherable, very detectable information. It's the moment that a video mentions something like COVID hoax or something like that, that the algorithm or the information filtering or detection systems can really pinpoint it very clearly. A bit like hate speech. As soon as you mention a sort of hate term, it gets flagged and then you're out pretty quickly, in my understanding. However, and when we did, so what you see here with these little bubbles are search results, or the ranking of search results for either one of these different queries: 5G, big pharma, American bioweapon, Chinese bioweapon, film your hospital, China cover, always in relation to COVID, over time, right? So the colors here also point out to the different kinds of results that you obtain over time. So in blue, it's news sources, that is trustworthy sources in YouTube's own terminology. Otherwise, you can also see a little bit of a hint of yellow there in big pharma, which means research sources. So research institutes or medical institutes that publish content. But in pink there that you see in China cover is, so again, on YouTube's terminology, borderline content. So that could also be conspiratorial stuff. And in this case, we see here that actually, indeed, YouTube's content moderation seems to be quite successful in that, so quote unquote, trustworthy sources are up in the rankings, and borderline sources actually don't really show up that often. But when you query something that reflects a much more complex narrative, for instance, a conspiracy, QAnon, the New World Order, anti-vax or hoax, then the picture is somewhat different. So you get not just, of course, trustworthy sources, but also somewhat more on the bottom of the results. You still find borderline contents that by size, and I forgot to mention that the bigger the dot, the bigger the views that the video got, by size at least indicate a degree of popularity. And so that means to us that the platform or moderating things like conspiracies equates kind of trying to moderate an entire, something much more complex than just units of false information. There's something more like in the order of worldviews. So radically alternative interpretations of the pandemic. And that's indeed the challenge in this case when we deal with public consensus, is if we want to kind of establish some metrics, to speak in algorithmic terms, or values that aid or help maintain consensus, and we think of trustworthiness or authority as a way to keep it, and so to have trustworthy sources come up the results and so on, then we can also consider another metric, which I guess is still under various drafts and scraps of design and various different updates of recommendation systems and search ranking systems. The idea of somewhat shared vision of reality, right? Consensus is a shared vision of reality, or understanding, public understanding. And so rather than relevance or trustworthiness as being metrics for these algorithms, it would be interesting indeed to try and operationalize an understanding of consensus there. One of the ways being, as also Marcel mentioned before, the idea of context, or any other information necessary to facilitate the understanding between users with very different media diets. So at least we can have something of a common understanding of what this crisis is about.
It's a good presentation. I think it also really is a good addition to the presentation from Marcel. We also got some questions coming in, and I would like to start with, it's more of an opinion question, but I think it also adds into a question that can actually be asked. I don't know if it was general academic distrust that caused European countries to not adapt at all any scientific findings from Asian countries, or if it's more about political reasons. Either way, I find it very inefficient and disappointing for people to start from scratch with this research while people are suffering with time, and there were so many findings you can always use if someone was open enough to talk to scientists from other countries. And that ties up to a question that was asked before, where he mentioned that the Asian countries have done research about, I think it was removed, about research on what are the effects, what do influence COVID. So did you take in, about fake news, did you take in consideration Asian studies about any hypotheses that have been proved or not?
On fake news? Not directly, I think indeed, and I very much adhere to the critique indeed that a lot of studies here are very centric to either European or American cases. In part also because if we want to understand the dissemination and the operation or the impact of fake news, we also need to kind of contextualize them within the platforms that are used by populations of these respective countries. And I understand that China, for instance, has platforms that, with the exception of TikTok, are not used here. I cannot confirm this personally, but I hear, at least through a lot of research, that those platforms are somewhat more, much more highly moderated and centralized, in contrast to somewhat more fragmented and contentious public discourse on social media here in Europe and the United States. So it's a slightly different picture. But I do hear this critique very much, at least when it comes to governmental guidances on COVID. This doesn't have so much to do with misinformation as to, I think, something in the order of geopolitics, which I'm not an expert of. But I do agree, of course, that Asia and Southeast Asia particularly have, I mean, decades of very thorough experience in containing pandemics that I was personally quite perplexed in seeing that European governments didn't seem to, at least publicly, express a lot of interest in.
And Marc, do you want to add?
I want to also reflect about that. I saw the question by Xiao and I agree with him. It looks like, or also in my view, very often Asian work is disregarded by researchers in Europe. But I observe also that researchers in Netherlands disregard work done in Germany or in other European countries. And what I'm missing is a little bit the coordination on research in Europe. Every country is investigating the role of children. Every country is investigating the role of masks. And they all start their own research. In so far I agree with Xiao, but I see it also internally in Europe that there is a lot of negatively said mistrust, positively said they want to double check it, and I think that a lot of energy could be used in another way by having more coordination between the research groups of the local RIVMs in Europe. What do you think about that, Emily?
Or Ivan?
Oh, yeah.
Marc, I'm sorry, I think I missed just the last sentence that you mentioned.
That it seemed like there is, if you say it in a negative way, there is a lot of mistrust among researchers worldwide, or more positively, they want to double check and replicate each other's work. Right. But I'm missing a lot of coordination between the research groups, even in the Netherlands and in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something I actually haven't thought about before, but if I have to think about it on top of my head, I would say first, I think there's perhaps in a somewhat perverse way, I'm not sure, with COVID, there is a lot of opportunity for a lot of research on misinformation to be done. And I guess perhaps some research groups would like to capitalize that for their own merit. There is perhaps that in terms of academic credits, which I guess is at fault of the academic, something along the lines of an academic system as it is. But it's not all that bad in the sense that there's a lot of data sharing of data sets collected. Perhaps even efforts to put together platforms where those data sets can be shared. Lots of sort of grassroots, bottom-up efforts to disseminate this information on COVID as it comes in a very uncertain setting. But above all, I assume, and that this doesn't really speak to my area of research, I don't know about Marcel's, but in medical, from what I understand, at least in the medical field, the skepticism is very much kind of, it seems amplified by geopolitical tensions that get in the way for vaccine and so on. But again, I don't have the sort of expertise to comment on that.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the time, and I think we have time for one more question, and we have one. So I would like to ask, if I may. With regards to the YouTube platform statements, how can something be obviously false if we just learned from Marcel that truth actually doesn't exist, just spheres with own norms? Mm-hmm. Who would now judge? What is the objective and what not?
I think YouTube, from what we saw, takes this question quite, understands this question in the sense that it doesn't appear that they claim that they know what is true or not. And that they put a lot of emphasis on their content moderation on the idea of context. So contextualize user-generated data in the context of conversations between users or the metadata and so on. And I think that's why they introduced something like a concept like borderline contents, which kind of translate into conspiracy theories or hateful contents and things like that. In an effort to kind of perhaps answer to pressures to do something about conspiracy theories and similar misinformation, while at the same time also appear not to censor it when it's something more in the order of interpretation or opinion or wild skepticism. So I think to answer your question directly, they have relatively quite sophisticated algorithms to understand what context is and to understand, sort of measure different degrees of authenticity in the information. But they also carve and operationalize different concepts of objectivity, so borderline contents, for instance, and have their, as far as I understand, their moderators and their algorithms try to understand that as much as possible. But it's
Marcel, would you like to add something to this, or
no.
Do you say, yeah, I've said my word, this is my definition? No,
this what I said about. I said I'm not a relativist. I'm not a relativist. So I would answer the question by saying, okay, YouTube can say the truth doesn't exist, but given the current state of affairs, of knowledge in the scientific community, we are convinced that this is bullshit or something like that. So although the truth doesn't exist, we still can talk about bullshit and non-bullshit.
Yeah, by defining it a little bit differently. Yeah. I want to thank you very much, especially Emily and Marcel. We will send you a small present also. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.